Good morning, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the World Economic Forum. As a non-morning person, I'm hugely appreciative of the effort you've made to come here for breakfast. So thanks very much for coming, and hopefully we'll have a very fascinating debate over the next hour and a half. I'm Drexler. I work at the World Economic Forum, looking after the investors industries here, and also represent the office as part of our management committee. And things you might not know about us, many of you will have heard of our flagship event in Davos, but when we're not in Davos in January, we spent the year very importantly, and probably more importantly, researching areas where public-private cooperation is needed, where misperceptions abound, and where solutions are necessary for improving the state of the world, as our mission says. And in many ways, Brazil is a good example at the moment where misperceptions abound, problems exist, and solutions need to be found to help one of the world's largest economy to grow again and find an appropriate footing and adapt to foreign interest and investment. So I was very grateful when James approached us to host this together, and it took me about 1 second to say yes. And we're very happy about the collaboration, and I'd like to hand over to you, James.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I would like to start by thanking the World Economic Forum. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss a topic that is of extreme and growing importance in Brazil, elsewhere, but in particular in Brazil. I'd like to thank you all for coming here this morning. I'd like to thank the speakers. I'd like to thank FGV for coming, Monica and Fernanda. I think we're going to have a good discussion. I look forward to having a very interactive conversation. Any questions, any comments you have, we'd be happy to hear that, and we have quite a bit of time in order to do that. So in order to get started, I'm going to just introduce our moderator, Fernanda Bach. She is a New York-based Brazilian journalist. She's been working for all the major Brazilian broadcasting television networks for the past 15 years. She has a master's degree, master's in sustainability from the Fundação do Cabral. She's moderated and hosted several events in Latin America. She's been everywhere. And today she's with The Economist. She's written for the Huffington Post, the Briggs Post, SVT. She has a lot of experience, and we look forward to hearing her comments, and I'm going to hand over to her. Fernanda.
Thank you, James. This one's work. So, competitiveness and entrepreneurship are two massive topics in and on themselves alone. So the goal today is not to cover all of it, but to try and offer like an international context for entrepreneurship and competitiveness, and also to offer like a little bit of a glimpse into the regional differences of this continental country that is Brazil. It's very unique, but the nuances are not so obvious. This event is designed to be interactive, so the more you participate, the more we are all going to benefit. And in order to do that, we have 3 great speakers with us today. Monica de Bolle is from the Peterson Institute in Washington, and at The Economist, she is known as a rock star in all matters Brazil. It's a unanimity, like over there, it's true. Cesar came all the way from Brazil, from Fundação Getúlio Vargas. FGV, it's one of the world's most reckoned think tanks. And he talks to foreigners, foreign investments all the time, trying to explain Brazil. That's a tough task, right? And he also, he's going to talk about a study that FGV put together on competitiveness, and also innovation and entrepreneurship. And then our host from the World Economic Forum, Michael Drexler, he's going to also talk about a study that was released in January on competitiveness and entrepreneurship. So, no further ado, let's start this. Monica, I'd like to start with you. And would you give us a macro perspective? Is it working?
I think
so. Okay, cool. Would you give us a macro perspective in your overview on entrepreneurship and competitiveness in Brazil today, and what's going on?
Okay.
Where are we going, where we are?
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank the World Economic Forum and the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for the kind invitation and to speak on a topic which is obviously of paramount importance, although extremely difficult to talk about in the current circumstances in Brazil. Obviously, to speak of competitiveness and innovation and everything that goes with it, one needs first to step back and think a little bit about where we are in terms of with the macroeconomic situation of the country, and obviously it's not good, as all of you know. I have lost count of how many times I've been asked, both here in New York as well as in DC, the question, but Brazil was doing so well just 2 years ago, what happened? You know, and it's kind of hard to answer that question in 5 minutes because it's been a long process. I mean, I think what has brought the country to where it is at the moment is not easy to explain. It's not something that you can just, put down to one or two things, but really it's been a sequence of things. Yes, the external environment has been very relevant, so the fall in commodity prices and everything that's happened since has obviously had a role to play. But more importantly, I think there's been a very, very dramatic deconstruction of macroeconomic policies and of the macroeconomic framework. And this is where I think, the last 2 years, starting in early 2014, and of course aggravated this year by the political repercussions and the ramifications from the corruption scandal at Petrobras, everything has kind of come to a head in these last few years. So just to put some numbers on these things, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with them, but the things that are most striking to me, obviously the first is what's happening to growth, where the country is going to face a very, very deep recession this year, probably around 3%, but there are those who think it might actually be somewhat larger than 3%. This is about the largest recession Brazil has had in 30, 40 years. And there's the prospect of another year of recession going into 2016, which would make it a first since the Great Depression. So I think this is the first kind of headline and very worrying perspective that one has when one looks at what's going on in the country. The second thing is the fiscal numbers. The fiscal numbers have been deteriorating dramatically, very, very, very dramatically. One cannot stress enough how horrible the fiscal trajectory in Brazil has become. At the beginning of 2014, we had a nominal deficit, which is the difference between revenues and expenditures, including expenditures on interest payments on the debt, of the order of 3% of GDP. We are now at 9.3% of GDP, so that figure has more than tripled and rising. It's going up, not down. And it's going up and not down because for several reasons, the country has failed to put in place a fiscal adjustment, an adequate fiscal adjustment. The kind of fiscal adjustment that Brazil needs is not your run-of-the-mill fiscal adjustment. So it's not just a question of raising some revenues and cutting some expenditures. It's really a question of going deeply into the budget and breaking and doing away with indexation measures that currently make the expenditure execution extremely difficult, doing away also with the links that exist between revenues and expenditures, so that in Brazil, whenever you have a revenue increase, that often amounts to an expenditure increase as well, because they're earmarked, the two of them, so it has to do with breaking these two links. It also has to do with doing away with the minimum wage indexation rule that was reintroduced in 2006, and that actually has a number of bad repercussions for the budget itself, because there are benefits and social programs that are indexed to the minimum wage. It has to do with dealing with social security reform. So we're really talking about a set of reforms that if Brazil were a country that was under an IMF program, this would be the kind of laundry list of economic reforms that one would be asking the country to do. Brazil obviously is not under an IMF program because, among other things, it does have one crucial thing, which is a lot of reserves. It's got 370 billion dollars of international reserves, which has been Brazil's cushion for quite some time. In a way, it has also been, in a sense, one can think of this as a curse, because it has been the one thing that has left the country more or less complacent in terms of the necessity to actually get a grip on these fiscal issues and really go very deep into these structural reforms. Now, obviously, these structural reforms are not easy to implement. They would go a long way towards increasing competitiveness in Brazil, no doubt about that. But they are very politically charged, and of course the political environment in Brazil at the moment is, in a word, absolutely toxic. And it's very difficult to see how any of these things will get by before the macroeconomic situation gets worse than what it's actually been in recent years. What surprises me currently about Brazil is the level of tolerance that society as a whole has had for the kind of macroeconomic deterioration that we've seen. So, recession, unemployment, rising inflation, and yet, there has been no sense of, or at least the way I've seen it, having been there and talking to people, there are sections of society who perceive problems as being extremely severe, and other sections that think, these are cyclical problems and we'll just get over them, which is in itself worrying, because it tells you something about, the timing of when these reforms are likely to come through. On inflation itself, and I'll try to end my comments here so I don't take too long. One thing that I've been saying whenever I have the chance to speak to Brazilian counterparts or participate in events or even in events like this is that Brazil is at a juncture where adjustment is going to happen no matter what. Now, it can happen in a more structured and organized way, which would be through fiscal adjustment and the implementation of measures that go deep into the kind of structural issues that Brazil has. That requires coordination between the government and the legislative sides, something that we have not seen to this point. But that is where, the fiscal adjustment is where Congress, society, and government have a say in what's going to happen to the country going forward. And that is one way out of the current mess. The other way out, which is not exactly a way out of the mess itself, but it's an adjustment process nonetheless, is inflation. So adjustment either happens because you put in place a fiscal adjustment, or it happens because there's no fiscal adjustment, there's no other anchor trying to sort of put the macroeconomy together, and then the end result is that inflation will adjust your problems away in a very, very perverse way, as we have seen in the past in Brazil. Currently, I fear that we're going that direction without actually knowing that we're going that direction. So when I speak to even my counterpart economists in Brazil, a lot of people seem to think, well, inflation isn't that bad of a problem because there's a recession and it will fall going into next year. But that's not what we're seeing. When we look at the inflation numbers for the last few months, what we see is gradual acceleration of inflation. And the reason for it is very simple. Brazil is a country that's used to living with high inflation. It's a country that does know how to re-index the economy very, very fast. It's doing that. If we look at the recent wage negotiations that are going on in the country, we see that the benchmark for everything has become 10%. So everyone is currently readjusting prices, wages, what have you, at 10%. That's a knock on competitiveness right there. So that's what I would like to leave my first remarks on. Adjustment's going to happen. Is it going to happen the right way, or is it going to happen the wrong way? That's the kind of choice the country's facing at the moment. Thank you.
Monica, thank you for this very robust overview. Michael, now the word's with you. So the World Economic Forum study believes that one of the reasons we're doing this event suggests that the relationship between entrepreneurship and competitiveness is not that straightforward. And it sounds very counterintuitive that where you have competitiveness, you not have entrepreneurship, or the other way around. Can you talk a little bit about this and the dimensions of entrepreneurship and what you find?
Of course, thank you. And I should say on that happy note, So we did a global research project together with Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which have the most comprehensive data on entrepreneurship around the world. And we essentially asked three major questions. One of them is across the population of a country. We're dying. So across the population of a country, how many of you either have started a company or are about to start a company? So how many of you are entrepreneurs by that definition? Then of those who are entrepreneurs, how many of you want to employ more than 20 people in 5 years? And we call that ambitious entrepreneurs. And it's a low ambition, but it's still an ambition. And then the third question is, how many of you who are entrepreneurs think that you're introducing a new product or a new service into the economy? So which of you are innovators? And what we find is that the correlation of entrepreneurial activity and competitiveness is actually an inverse one. So it leads to the topic that in many non-competitive economies, people don't have employment, so they become forced entrepreneurs. And Brazil is sadly one of those examples. So when I look at low competitiveness countries globally, the percentage of entrepreneurial activity is 16%, and that's exactly where Brazil sits. Whereas if you look towards the more competitive global countries in Europe, the US, the proportion of entrepreneurship is 6%. So it tells you where Brazil is structurally falling. Now there are two other dimensions, those two other dimensions of entrepreneurship, ambition and innovation, that correlate positively with competitiveness. And that's where it gets very interesting, because Brazil, on the perspective of ambition, has 4% of all entrepreneurs say that they're ambitious, they want to grow beyond 20 employees in 5 years. So think about that, 1 in 5 entrepreneurs has that vision in Brazil. Whereas in other countries like the United States, or even in Latin America, countries like Chile, it's more like 20% of entrepreneurs. And innovation, the story is even more stark. In great examples of Latin America, Chile and Colombia, that ratio of innovation is 50%. In Brazil it's 6%. It's the lowest number of all of Latin America. And so that's kind of depressing if you think about it, but it also leads to two levers that the government can pull in order to foster entrepreneurship. And it's not to encourage more people to start small businesses and do nothing, because there's already a high rate of that going on. It's more about inspire people to scale their enterprises and to create employment. And so it's about creating role models, it's about working with organizations that create entrepreneurial networks, where that inspiration and those role models and those success stories can come through. So it's much more, the good news is it's much more about psychology and the narrative on that dimension than it is about hard structural changes, not that they're unimportant, but it's often overlooked. And on innovation, it's try and find knowledge transfer programs from universities, which is what other Latin American countries have done very well. Try to find, and this is a bit more structural, try to find intellectual property frameworks that work, that give entrepreneurs confidence that innovation is helpful and useful and protective. I think what's happening is Brazil has a huge domestic market, and that obviously is in many ways an advantage. But in other ways it can be a disadvantage because it leads to insularity. And I think that's where we see that lack of innovation in entrepreneurs, because they think very, very local. They don't think, okay, can I look globally and find something that works somewhere else and bring it into the country, which is how many successfully innovating countries work. And if I look at Startup Chile, that's what they're trying to do. They're attracting foreign entrepreneurs into the country to boost that innovation coefficient. So that would be my thoughts. It's not a good story on the data, but I actually think, and we think, it can be turned into a good story with comparatively little effort and goodwill by the government and by organizations in the country.
Thank you, Michael. So on to Cesar. Cesar, FGV released a study on competitiveness in partnership with the FT, with the Financial Times. And you can give also more information and details on the difference, on the regional differences and the different potentials across country. It's a continental country with a lot of inequality and a lot of paradoxes, as well as you're going to point out, right?
Good morning. Thank you for all for coming. Thank you, World Economic Forum and the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. I want to start presenting a brief overview of the Brazilian dimension and some highlights of competitive profile. A study developed by FGV and Financial Times. So let's try to move on. Does it work? Okay. As you may know, Brazil is a federative republic with 8.5 million square meters, with 26 states, 1 federal district, and more than 5.5 thousand municipalities. It has reached almost 204 million people, with 85% living in urban areas. I think it's remarkable that we got this 85% in urban areas. These numbers characterize Brazil's continental powerhouse. Consequently, in our opinion, to understand Brazil, we must look at Brazilian regional differences. If you don't see the difference between Brazil, you cannot understand Brazil. In order to help such understanding, FGV and the Financial Times prepare a comprehensive competitive profile of Brazil, and a deep regional analysis of the country's diversity and potential. Moreover, the report also allows Brazilian policy and decision makers. We always see reports talking about police makers, and we want to do a report for the people, for the business, to help them select the right place to invest or to understand more deeply. Finally, it's important to stress that we currently don't have a comparison with other countries. We leave that job to the World Economic Forum. They really do a great job. So, what is your main motivation behind this study? Many Brazilians and foreign investors have been asking us to recommend the best place for investment. South Brazil, North Brazil, Southeast. They usually ask, where is the right place to set up my office, my factory, or my business? It's not an easy answer if you don't see São Paulo. São Paulo is easy answer, but where is the best place to invest? To answer such questions, have in mind a continent-sized country like Brazil, with a lot of disparities among regions, we decided to develop a regional comparative approach to competitiveness. Actually, many of the factors that raise productivity are generated at subnational level, where competitiveness at subnational level is lacking. So we want to fulfill this lackness. So we are think tank, so we think that it's important to contribute with the country to understand all those issues. We found that most of the studies available for Brazil are focused at national and state level, but it's at regional level that the entire production process takes place. In such context, we develop a competitive profile including more than 500 microregions. Here I have to stress that our entire study was developed with available data, not through field research. So we use IBGE data and not questioning people what they think about this and that. Moreover, the report has special focus in Brazilian sectors. It analyzed the exposure of the 56 productive sectors of Brazil to exchange rate and taxes. Disposal is not homogeneous. Therefore, it's necessary to analyze each sector on a case-by-case basis. I will look closer at the end of my presentation. Let's talk about concepts. Okay. Our concept of regional competitiveness arises from the interaction of the following drivers: availability of natural resources and endowments, like energy resource, extractive resource, agriculture, etc. Structural factors affecting potential productivity, like technology, logistics, innovation, etc. Limiting factors, such as macroeconomic factors and those related to the business environment. The choice of these drivers took into consideration both of the specific features of Brazil as well as the rationality of the economic theory as a whole. Even more, these 14 dimensions were revealed through the use of a statistical method called principal component analysis. So we put all variables in a system and look at which one is or representative for the competitiveness. As I said before, the report comprises an analysis of the level of more than 500 microregions covering all states. Each microregion comprises average 10 municipalities, you can see drawing this map. As far as we know, this level of disaggregation has not been achieved in previous studies. For this reason's perspective, a set of comprehensive 224 indicators was structured across 6 vectors and 40 dimensions of competitiveness. Today, my presentation will pay special attention to the innovation dimension that considers the following aspects of crucial for competitiveness: availability of skilled labor, the amount of foreign direct investment, R&D environment, entrepreneurship and startup innovation. I will analyze this one more in detail. But for now, let's see the behavior of the innovation dimension demand. That's my amazing. So, in order to best understand this map, the color yellow corresponds to the weakest performance region, and the dark blue to the best performing one. Although the North is considered one of the worst competitive regions in Brazil, you can see in the slide with red circle that exists a considerable number of regional innovation hubs in Amazon, Piauí, Ceará, Pernambuco, Tocantins, among others. So this is a very amazing result. For our discussion today, I brought the analysis of entrepreneurship and startup innovation aspects. That is the result of combined analysis of the following indicators: number of venture capital firms, number of startups, number of entrepreneurs, number of angel investors, and number of service providers. In the next step, we can see the results. So let's try to move on. The best performing regions in entrepreneurship and startup innovation are the South, of course, and Southeast. Some good performing states in the Midwest and Northeast. This results impact in some way the performance of those regions in the overall ranking, as well as you can see in the next slide. This map is somehow intuitive. It presents the final results of the most competitive micro-regions in Brazil. As we can see, the aggregate competitiveness is not uniform, showing a wide difference among the Brazilian micro-regions and presenting some bright spots and highlight with the red circles. So now I have to mention the Brazilian crisis. The World Economic Forum report has recently pointed out, with a large fiscal debt and raised inflationary pressure, Brazil's weak microeconomic performance is negatively impacting the country's competitiveness. So, in our opinion, the regional competitiveness has been also impacted. But it wasn't part of our scope to measure macroeconomic impacts in different regions. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, we also have analyzed the exposure of 56 productive sectors of Brazil to major macroeconomic variables: exchange rate and fiscal burden. The graph shows the total direct and indirect exposure of the exchange rate on Brazilian sector in the same orders of impact. The exposure is not homogeneous. The following 3 big industries are the most impacted: machines and equipment, chemical, transport equipment. Other sectors, such as automotive industry, rubber, and plastic goods, are not so affected by exchange rate as you can see in these slides. As the Brazilian economy is passing through some turmoil, we started to review our regional study in order to have a broad idea of the real impacts of the crisis in the economy. We can already assure that the following dimension will be most affected by the crisis: social pressure, for example, cost of electricity, public sector performance, cuts in public spending leads to cuts in public investment, logistics, market size, purchasing power decrease, sustainability, like social inequality increase as well. As soon as we finish this approach, we can present it again. So, at the end, as main takeaways, I would like to highlight that This is a comprehensive report designed to provide a cohesive profile of Brazilian competitiveness, considering natural, technological, and institutional market and macroeconomic factors.
So, as we said yesterday in a meeting in the consulate, our goals are kind of low. We just want to become like the USA of South America. I think we have potential for that. For sure, lots of major changes have to happen for that to become true. But I'm happy to tell you that we are giving the first main steps for this chaos to get, to overcome. And so, thank you all for this opportunity to show you a little bit of this process. And we have a huge agenda here in the United States about this. And I hope we have really good results going back to Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Good luck. Just to give a little of a background on where Brazil stands right now on entrepreneurship and codes and laws and taxes. In Brazil, it takes around 6 months for you to open a company if you want to open one. In Rwanda, it takes 2 days. I interviewed this very talented young guy called Marcos from Blue Box, that is like a startup. I think it's a scale-up right now. But his headquarters are in Argentina, because there he can pay for the PhDs. And I'm not saying Argentina is is great. I'm just saying that these are some information that we need to reflect on them. And it would be great if we could pass this code. Because as of right now, Brazilian entrepreneurships, they are working on a code that is from the 50s. And you don't even know where to pay your taxes. So what do? You open up a branch of your company in Miami. So we desperately need this.
From the 19th century.
Yes. Oh, really? So I need an update. And I was also sharing with them. It's in the cover of one of the most read magazines in Brazil. That if you are a scale up, you're punished for trying to grow. So we need to tackle that. We need to address that. On that note, I also think it's very important that we commit on approaching the difficulties and the issues with a forward-looking approach. Just sitting here and talking about what's wrong is not going to solve anything. So I think it's important to look globally and think okay, who is doing it right? What are the lessons that we can learn from other countries? So Monica, you're really excited about Mexico. What can we learn from them? And there's a limit also to what we can mimic and to what extension we can apply. But what do you think? Where should we look for inspiration?
Well, you mentioned Mexico, so let me pick up on that theme. Latin America as a whole is having many problems, including Mexico, so it's not as if Mexico is the reference case for everything, but there are at least a couple of things that not only Mexico, but countries like Colombia and Peru and Chile have done recently and have been doing actually for a number of years. And that we in Brazil perhaps should be thinking about. The obvious. We need to get our macroeconomic framework back. Until we do that, any effort, apart from some very important ones, and certainly it is great to hear that Brazil's commercial codes are being overhauled because 19th century, come on. We're 2 centuries beyond that. So it's great to hear that these efforts are ongoing, and I'm sure they will bear fruit down the road, but we really do need to get our act together on the macroeconomic front, and it's urgent. It's urgent. It's not something that can wait another 6 months, or another 7 months, or 8 months, or another year. It has to be done now. These countries, by the way, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, are slowing down, as all commodity producers are, with the exception of Mexico, which is not exactly a commodity producer. But they do have very sound macro frameworks, and they haven't really weakened their macro frameworks in the last few years, and that helps them. a lot in this process where, you know, we have a number of risks out there, we have China slowing down, we have the Fed about to do its liftoff, and you know, these countries with their sound frameworks are pretty much in shape to deal with these challenges, whereas Brazil is obviously not. But the one thing that these countries have been doing over a span of years, and Brazil has done absolutely nothing for at least 20 years, is trade and openness. And this is where, you know, you have a kind of an endogeneity problem, because you can think, well, we don't have competitiveness and hence we can't have greater trade openness. But you could also spin that argument on its head and say, well, we don't have any trade openness, so where are the carrots and sticks and the incentives for actually having competitiveness? And I think where we are is pretty much there in terms of, you know, what kind of blocks us from having greater competitiveness. The country has chosen to isolate itself for the last 20, 25 years. And now is the time to rethink this, you know, it's better late than ever, and it's certainly the time to rethink this whole process. Because when you look across the Latin American spectrum and at these countries specifically, these countries have been very aggressive in pushing through, you know, greater integration with the world and greater trade integration. Mexico is the one country that has probably one of the largest, it has the largest bilateral agreements with countries around the world. It has like over 40 bilateral agreements with countries around the world. The Pacific Alliance countries, which include all of these four that I just mentioned, together have a bunch of, you know, bilateral agreements as well. Two of those countries, Chile and Peru, are in TPP. Brazil is completely outside of that discussion. That discussion has only now started to sink in Brazil, and people are starting to realize, oh, we're out of TPP, and that's going to be a problem, where the discussion has been ongoing for 5 years. So I think this is the moment, you know, when you have, this is kind of a cliche, but when you have a crisis, this is when you have the opportunity to change things. And I think if anything, that's the most of the positive note I can get out of this, Fernanda. I'm sorry, I can't get any more positive.
It's not supposed to be positive, it's just supposed to be forward-looking.
But in terms of where we should be going, we should be heading in that direction for sure. It's not as if trade is not going to save us by any means, but it's certainly going to help us modernize. It's certainly going to help us improve competitiveness. It's certainly going to help us push in, you know, those regions, those few bright blue spots that we see in your graphs. It's certainly going to help, you know, integrate those into the rest of the Brazilian economy more broadly, and so on. So I think this is clearly the direction we should be going.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think we should take a Pollyanna approach whatsoever. I don't think that will help things. But yeah, so what you're saying is like it's a choice. We have to, you know, just choose to do the right thing. And Michael, I saw you nodding throughout like Monica's comments, so I'd like to get your impressions on that, and like for you to give a comparison to other countries as well. And what do you think we could do better?
Yes. Microphone for the graveyard here. I'd reiterate some of my earlier points, which is focus on success stories in a world where people like Ike Bautista, for whatever right or wrong, make the headlines. It's very hard for a budding entrepreneur to actually find those positive role models, and so that of course means opening up as well and finding them in other networks. And so organizations in my mind like Endeavor Global, who create those entrepreneurial networks and ecosystems and help entrepreneurs from one country connect with entrepreneurs from another country, are hugely helpful. And again, this doesn't cost an awful amount of taxpayer money, which is good news. As a European and as an adopted American, I'm very much in favor of some of the macro solutions like better immigration, more openness. I'm also very painfully aware of how difficult those will be for politicians to get through. So I was nodding with my rational mind and my economist mind, but I'm also thinking this is going to be a huge challenge for a government that's already under pressure. And it's in a way incumbent on all of us in the room who are decision makers to find points of influence that help to get that story across, that, like for example in the case of Mexico, openness to the US and to other economies does not mean economic worsening, it actually means economic betterment. And to me, and that's something we see at the World Economic Forum as we work with many countries around the world, it's very often translating the facts into a narrative that resonates with society. If all the people, that's what the government would need to do, but they can't do it by themselves. They need other people to give them that ammunition. So that would be my thoughts. It's focus on the positive narrative beyond the numbers, because the numbers speak a very clear language.
On a micro level as well, I was talking to this Endeavor executive, I told you this yesterday, and he is a serial entrepreneur, and he told me one of the problems in Brazil is that entrepreneurs don't know how to think big. It costs the same thing to dream big and to dream small, but we are used to dreaming small. And we just need to, this is on a very, very micro level. We need to do all the adjustments and all that Monica was talking about, but it's a cultural also adjustment. It's a social and cultural adjustment. And Michael, you were comparing the message when we were talking about UK and the US and how different countries deal with crisis. And what are your findings?
Yeah, and this was in a former life. I confess to having worked in the financial sector and having seen both London and New York through the financial crisis, where in a way both these cities were at the epicenter of it. It was very interesting to compare the UK, who almost entered clinical depression for a period of a few years after the crisis, and you compare this with New York, who even through the worst of the crisis always had a sense of exuberance about them. And national stereotypes, of course, only carry so far, but if you look at what has made America strong, it's that sense of exuberance, almost in denial of the facts. Like, yes, we're completely down, but we're great. We're gonna solve this. And the UK has many other advantages, but their national psychological temperament is a little more on the either realistic or cynical side, whichever way you want to see it. And that has very clear implications on how a country deals with the crisis or with adversity. And so Pollyannishness might not be the right answer necessarily, but a little bit of more of an upbeat thinking and stepping away from the victimhood, which also runs very strong in many narratives, is very important now. I'm not suggesting to put Brazil on Prozac.
Maybe just for a while. And one of the things that we discussed also previously was that, like, when I came to the US to do my master's degree, I was really impressed and shocked at the same time by a question in the personal essay that you have to write. They ask you what was your best failure? And to me, I could not grasp the concept. Like, how can a failure be good or best, you know? And it made me think. And I think, like, socially and culturally, like, it's something that we need to think about. Like, why we're not that comfortable with, like, it's just another step in order to succeed. And I'm not talking macro level, I'm talking very micro level, like entrepreneurial, like, spirit and all that. So Cesar, you need to do a lot of explaining to, like, foreigner like businessmen on Brazil. What is the hardest thing to explain?
There's a lot of things hard to explain. So why the education system is so bad? Why we have this budgetary problem? So nowadays we spend 40% of our money in pension funds. So this is amazing how high it is. So we spend 400 billion in pension and 200 billion in education. So we spend 200 billion in salary for the public sector. We spend 100 million in health. So you have to solve this kind of problem to solve our macroeconomic situation. But people are asking if Brazil is going to survive after this 2 years crisis or 3 years crisis, and I hope so. So it's not easy to understand Brazil. It's not for amateur. I think it's a very complex country, and it's also very difficult to compare with other countries. It would be more easy if you compare Brazil to India or South Africa or whatever, China. But, you know, if you compare Brazil to Anglo-Saxon countries like the US and UK, it's very difficult. If you compare to Mexico, they got a border with the United States, so it's also different. If you compare Brazil to Chile, Chile is like a Rio de Janeiro country. So it's a very, very small, small country. So it's not easy to understand, but and 2 years ago, we were in a very good shape. So maybe we can see. And also what is very difficult is the political situation. Nowadays, as our education level is too low, it's difficult for common people to understand our problem. If the people cannot support the measures that we have to do, it will be more difficult to find solutions. We are in a democracy country, so it's even difficult. So I have to explain like that for the foreigners.
We were talking about the commercial code and how difficult it is for local people to do business in Brazil. But for foreigners that want to come to Brazil, when the Economist published this cover where Jesus Christ was rocketing up and all that, then rocketing down, but in 2010, 2009, a bunch of friends asked me, like, how can I get into Brazil? And like none of them managed to get a visa. So it's not even like they cannot arrive there. That's one of the issues, right? So and you're telling me, Cesar, that like you face a problem like this with the Chinese, right?
I was invited by the Chinese consul to talk about Brazil investment, and the Chinese came every year, many delegations to Brazil. And I said to him, I just finished my Metro Line 4 feasibility study, and it was very succeeded, and we bought materials from China. And then he said to me, I'm waiting for 9 months to have a visa for our engineers to test the train that's already in the port. So it's amazing, this kind of problem that we still have.
Mm-hmm. Michael, you want to comment on that?
It's not to say anything, but this needs fixing. And again, there's a different narrative to be had between small numbers of visas for highly skilled people on a temporary basis, which is what I think. I wouldn't be even specific about Brazil. It's what all countries need. That's the exchange of knowledge, that's the exchange of talent that in a global economy you need. And it's a very different narrative between that small number of highly skilled visas and a huge number of low-skilled labor visas, which will get big backlash from society. And as a European, I wouldn't want to throw the first stone here, because Europe is currently going through exactly that problem, and it's not like we're setting best practice here in Europe. But it's to draw that distinction between what a country needs from the outside world and where it does need to guard its national interest, that clearly needs more delineation. And so denying Chinese engineers a visa to test a critical piece of Brazilian infrastructure is just madness, even if it might be guided by the very laudable game of protecting some of the local workforce. And so somebody, and I don't know Brazil well enough as to do that, somebody needs to understand the distinction and act accordingly.
Mm-hmm. So my colleagues at the EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, think that things are going to start to look better in the second half of next year, which seems a little bit optimistic if we see like the whole conjuncture. Monica, you gave an interview to Estadão, like a Brazilian newspaper, saying that no, Brazil is gonna comer o pão que o diabo amassou. What in like a translation means, I'm gonna try, but like Brazil's gonna go through hell still. And I'm not sure if it reflects the authenticity of the quote, like comer o pão que o diabo amassou. Maybe you have a better translation for this in English. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on like. It really depends on what we do with our choices, with the choices we make and what we do. But like, do you have a guess of when it's going to get better?
Well, first we have to digest, right? Which is, I think, what we're in the process of doing. And as I was saying before, I don't think. I mean, we look at Brazil a few years back, and we have this impression that the country was actually doing well 2 years ago, but it was not. I mean, when you look at the underlying macro policies, and I've been one I've been saying this for 5 years. I think I've been saying this since 2010. I write a lot for Brazilian newspapers, so at least I can say it's all documented, because it's all in the papers, you know. And for the last 5 years, I've been saying that. Look, the world is about to go into a phase of commodity cycle reversion, and Brazil is going the opposite way in terms of trying to find its right macroeconomic footing. So the whole problem, I think, that we currently face, I mean, we can go back as far as we want, because of course there are all the corruption problems and all that have been present in Brazil for decades. This is not new. But if we're thinking of the actual economic deconstruction, maybe we can time it to 2010, maybe we can time it to 2011. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that it's been an ongoing process for many, many years. And we just hadn't seen, or at least the numbers didn't show it to be as dramatic, because obviously right after the financial crisis, we did have the response by many countries that, you know, stimulated their own economies, and Brazil reaped the benefits of that. So, you know, the underlying fiscal framework was deteriorating, but revenues were improving because the economy was still growing and it was still looking good 2 years ago. But there was weakness, and there was growing weakness and fragmentation underneath. And this is what I think many people fail to recognize, certainly the government failed to recognize, thought that, you know, by enhancing some of the policies that were actually weakening the macro framework, they would get growth back. Well, guess what? Growth did not come back, and we actually imploded the fiscal side. So when you refer back to my quotation, and I certainly have no idea how to translate that into English, but think of it as a digestive process. So we've gone through, you know, this years and years and years of doing things in an incorrect way. Now we're going through the digestion of that process, and it's being, you know, very difficult because of the political constraints and the political dysfunction that the country's facing. So that's making this whole process of digestion a lot more difficult. And when I look out into 2016, you know, I still think we haven't even started the fiscal adjustment. We've been talking about measures, and we've been saying things like, okay, we need to reintroduce things such as the CPMF, which, by the way, doesn't look like it's going to get through Congress. Perhaps, you know, one of you has better ideas about this, but it certainly doesn't look that way. And I had the opportunity to connect with a friend of mine who has an opinion. He has his own opinion pollster, and he did a recent poll on CPMF, which is the financial transactions tax that the government is banking on, literally, to get, you know, some revenues next year. And the population vehemently rejects CPMF, those who know what CPMF is. So there are about 48% of the Brazilian population who have no clue what the CPMF is. But regardless whether or not they have a clue, their response is, well, if it's another tax, I don't want it. So, you know, so the actual measures that need to be done have to go much deeper. Yes, there are huge political constraints in facing all of these issues, just as there are huge political constraints in facing, you know, the questions of where do we go with trade openness and where do we go with a number of other factors. But we have to start asking these questions. We have to. It's just, you know, there's no other choice.
Yeah, it comes back also to the social and cultural aspect of things, where here you have like a good grasp of why you pay taxes because you have a lot in return. In Brazil, it's hard for people to see things clearly because they don't feel they have a lot in return when they pay for taxes. And that goes also back to the corruption thing, because you see all these people embezzling all this money, and oh, I'm going to pay taxes for them to do that again. So it's like you see history repeating itself, and it's sad. So Michael, what do you think is the impact of all these corruption scandals and all this, you know, turbulence, political turbulence for entrepreneurship and competitiveness?
It's certainly not a good one, that's for sure. And again, I would say, looking forward, Brazil is not the only country with corruption problems. So again, no one needs to beat themselves up too badly. But other countries, and I use the example of China, are grappling with this in a very visible way. and are making changes in a very visible way, and that's probably what's needed to restore confidence. This isn't something that goes away by just sort of not talking about it, because the very nature of corruption is it exists in the shadows, and so the more shadows are perceived, the worse the image gets. I think on the topic of taxes, one suggestion could also be, and this is also true, by the way, for many Western countries where the tax burden is going up and governments are losing, in a sense, the trust and the legitimacy, to earmark more of the taxes towards concrete improvements. It goes a long way towards restoring trust, because it's one thing to say, I'm the government, pay me, and I'm going to do whatever I think is right. It's quite another thing to say, I'm the government, pay me, and here is exactly where your money will go. And the nice analogy is, and culturally, again, there are of course differences, but rich people in the US don't necessarily like to pay taxes, and they're very vocal about it, but they're very active in philanthropy. Now, why is this? Because philanthropy, they feel they can see the impact of their money. So it's not people don't like to give money away, they just like to know where it goes. That, to me, would be a potential for improvement on the transparency side and on the tax side. And again, corruption is a difficult thing, and Brazil is in no way alone, so there are many other countries where exchanges can be had, practices can be shared. We are at the World Economic Forum emboldened by the impact that technology can have at rooting out corruption. So when you tender for a project, you now can put everything, all the documentation online for people to review. 30 years ago this was impossible because there was no online, and so you can do that. You can have people monitor projects with their cell phones and take pictures, and you can have people monitor elections that way. And so there's a lot of solutions out there that, if there is willingness to do something about corruption, can be employed. And again, I'm not an expert on either the Brazilian government or Brazilian psychology or indeed Brazilian corruption. So people who are need to figure it out, but there are solutions in that.
We also have to say, for instance, in the Economist has put together the Brazil Summit, that is like a big reunion meeting with, like, to thank the country. And in 2012 we had Marcelo Odebrecht, Otávio de Azevedo, Ike Batista, and Maria das Graças Foster. This year we had Sérgio Moro, alongside with with the Minister of Finance, Joaquim Levy. But that says something also about the institutions. The institutions are also working. I've never thought in my lifetime I would see Marcelo Odebrecht jail. I never thought this would happen. And I don't think it's a good or a bad thing. I just think it's a reflection of, well, the institutions are working. And I'm not trying to say like that's amazing. I'm just saying that there's something to be said on that note as well. So Cesar, on this topic, do you think how do foreign businessmen, how do they interpret what's happening in the country right now?
Yeah, it's very high, of course. But the failure that we need a very bad investment that creates also corruption. Like we start 5 refineries all over Brazil, billions of dollars was invested. We start a lot of things that only create some misunderstanding of what is going on before. But as you said, the institutions are working. And people now are paying for that. But people have to pay about the bad policies. Petrobras nowadays, someone calculate that Petrobras lost 260 billion reais, and the corruption maybe 200 million, or 300 million, or 400 million. I think the problem is not only corruption, but bad decisions. I think this is the worst case.
So we are kind of running out of time, but before we open up for Q&A, I'd like to ask the panelists for final nuggets of wisdom, main takeaways of the day, and how we can tackle competitiveness and entrepreneurship in Brazil. So who wants to go first? Monica, you want to go first? It doesn't need to be positive. It doesn't need to be positive.
Well, you already know my bias, so I think to actually get a proper handle on, where we go. Of course, there will be, and as there always are, punctual initiatives that can be done and that, as may benefit one sector or another sector. And Cesar may correct me if I'm wrong. But I think overall, if we're trying to get a grasp, and it's a very difficult one because we're talking about competitiveness in aggregate terms, and it's not as if economists themselves actually have a very good grasp of what that means in the aggregate. We know what it means sectorially. We know what it means at the firm level. We have a very hard time figuring out what it actually means for the country. But my general sense is that you get nowhere unless you have a good macroeconomic framework. So I go back to my theme, and sorry to be so insistent on this, but we need an adequate fiscal framework. We need to get monetary policy in Brazil working again. Currently, monetary policy in Brazil is doing nothing for a host of reasons. Inflation is very high, and yet the central bank is keeping the interest rates on hold. Yes, interest rates have already been raised significantly. Nonetheless, inflation expectations are not anchored when you look towards the medium term. That means that in thesis, the central bank should have been acting still. It's not. Why is it not? There are many reasons. A, the recession. B, there's a credit crunch in the economy, so if conditions are already very difficult. And C, the fiscal. The fiscal is an issue for the central bank as well, because as long as you have an extremely high nominal deficit, it's not an easy thing to raise interest rates any further. So monetary policy is currently bound by this fiscal issue, and this fiscal issue itself is bound by politics. So there's this perfect knot. It's not even Gordian, it's perfect. There's this perfect knot in the Brazilian economy that needs to be untied before anything can actually progress. And I think the sense that I want to leave you with is that there's urgency here, and if you and others can get the message across about the urgency of getting things resolved, that would be great. So I'll leave it there. They're not exactly nuggets of wisdom, but I'll leave it there.
You gotta love her enthusiasm and her vibrancy, right? That's you gotta love her. So it's a hard act to follow, but who wants to go next, Cesar or Michael?
So,
Nuggets of wisdom?
I'm not so pessimist. But I think we still have a lot of opportunity, and the macroeconomic situation is going to be fixed. I don't know if 2 years or 3 years, but people are aware of that. The problem is the education. We have to talk to people that cannot understand these issues, so this is very, very difficult. But I think we have to talk to the parliament, so for them to understand how deep is our problem. If we can convince them that we have to do this quickly, and I think we are going to solve our problem. But there's still a lot of opportunity there, and we are very optimistic in 3 years' time.
Okay, Michael?
Whenever I hear the word wisdom, I normally run a mile, so now that's not on stage. So, echoing the point on urgency, I would say there's another sense of urgency at a more micro level, and I'll share an example from the US, but it could easily travel to Brazil. So for those of you who live in the US, there's a new brand of yogurt that's been super successful over the last few years called Chobani yogurt. And the story is that of a Turkish immigrant who found that yogurt on sale is not very good, and so he brought Greek yogurt to the US. Classic example of innovation, classic example of an entrepreneur who scaled up from a very low base, so he was ambitious, and classic example of an immigrant who did this for the betterment of all of American society. It's not like this guy's taking the spoils back home. And I think a country as large as Brazil will have many examples like this guy, and we need to find them and get them out in the public so people get inspired again.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to open up for Q&A, please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, very instructive. I enjoyed very much the presentations. I'm Lucia Maiorat from the Consulate General of Brazil, and I feel that I have to say something about visa. I think that everyone here knows that there are different kinds of visas, and 9 months is not an average time for a visa at all. If you want to go to Brazil to work there, to live there, it's more complicated, and it has to go through the Ministry of Labor. It's not much different to what happens when someone, a foreign person, wants to come here and work here at the United States. If you need a business visa, please don't be scared. It is easy. You just go to the website of the Consulate General of Brazil in New York. All the information is there, and it doesn't take that time. Thank you. Do you have a question? Do you have a question? No, I don't have a question. Just to clarify. Thank you. Thank you.
That's very reassuring to hear. Thank you.
Do we have questions from anyone here?
Thank you very much. Lisa Chanel at the Standard & Poor's. It was a great discussion. Like a couple of comments, but then a question. I think that I would fully echo the point that Monica made. The Brazil deterioration is not something that just happened. It's been in the making for more than the 2 years. The economy, fiscal accounts were really 3% 2 years ago. They were, you know, if you think about the below the line machinations that we've had, they were worse for a number of years. And in terms of the corruption, I think the fact that it is being openly prosecuted, investigated, is something that does set Brazil apart from peers in the region. The collateral damage, the spillover effects are significant, and that's and they're greater than I think any of us had anticipated. But the process is occurring, and that can contrast with some other important economies in the region where investigation of corruption doesn't even really occur, and prosecutions fail. So I think that's an important point to highlight. I think a question I would love to have more color on, both from all of you, but particularly kind of the map that you showed, where the bright spots are in terms of competitiveness. Could you give more concrete examples of the types of companies? Because we have seen success stories. I would, you know, obviously the big picture you've heard over the years is Embraer, but more, you know, you've had a lot of success stories more recently. And Natura is one that I would think about. But I think, where are could you give some more granularity to, you know, be it in the Amazon, in the Northeast and in the South, kind of the qualitative, you know, what are the specific kind of profiles of the companies, and maybe Michael, you could touch on that, kind of bringing in why maybe there's success there as opposed to elsewhere in terms of presumably innovation there.
Maybe it is related to technology. You know, a lot of these small, not small, but those states are investing in education, like Ceará, for example. They improve a lot their education standard. And so now they are able to receive more innovative, skilled people. And they do a nice policy regarding technological aspect of the economy. So I think that you can point out a lot of different spots in Brazil, but mainly in technological aspects.
If I take from there, that might be a little bit of a problem, because not all innovation is technological, and it presupposes a high level of education, which in what we've heard on the education system might hold back. So maybe one of the answers is to cast the definition of innovation more broadly and the stories more broadly. I'm heartened by some of the multipliers I see, so rather than going into individual countries, I'm heartened by some of the venture capital scene that I see coming up, and particularly when that venture capital scene doesn't try to mirror Silicon Valley venture capitalists, but takes a more local and in that sense social angle. And without any specific endorsement, I would mention funds like Vox Capital, who say we invest in enterprises that are innovative, but also have a social component to their impact and their innovation, because a country with, and again Brazil is not unique in this, but there's huge inequality. Anything that makes that inequality better will be helpful in lifting society as a whole and helping policymakers do the adjustments that are necessary.
Professor?
One of the things that has been left out is the demographic change that has been underway in the case of Brazil, which is very important. It's important because Brazil is getting older, and Brazil will have a very large percentage of its income going in pensions, government pensions, and that creates deficits. And the law has just been changed, which will increase those costs over time. I think this is a very important and fundamental reality that will have to be dealt with. Nobody seems to be much concerned about it at the moment, but you make any kind of projection into the future, what you discover is that the ratio of workers to those who are older is going down. And that is a situation which is going to leave much less savings for investment. Brazil already has the lowest investment rate. It's at 16% currently. There's no way that Brazil can grow at any reasonable rate, given its infrastructure problems, at less than a rate of investment of 24, 25%. And it seems to me that's where the basic problem lies, independently of the government. The state sort of set all of this in motion, but it has been coming, as we all know, for a while. And the inability to comprehend a situation where you have so much consumer credit that represents a large proportion of financial credit that is available. So you have people paying 30, 40% of their income each year in order to cover what they have bought on credit. These are fairly fundamental things that do have to be changed.
So Monica, I see you have the mic ready.
Thank you very much for raising that point. It's a crucial one. I kind of skimmed it when I spoke of Social Security reform, but as you correctly point out, it's not enough. I mean, we can raise the retirement age in Brazil, and this is being talked about and it's being discussed. We can, do the other kinds of reforms that would perhaps break away with some of these indexation measures that, make reducing Social Security spending very, very difficult. But we do have an underlying structural problem that no government can really address, which is the fact that the population is getting older. Brazil went through what's the so-called demographic bonus over the last 10 to 15 years. It has pretty much squandered this demographic bonus by not investing in education, which is perhaps, the best way to use your demographic bonus when you have it. And now we're faced with this situation where, we haven't really advanced on that front. And on the other hand, we do have these growing liabilities into the future because, of course, population aging is going to get increasingly more serious, and it's here now. It's not one of these things it's not one of these issues that you kind of think, well, yeah, okay, the pension issue is a problem, but that's like 10, 15, 20 years down the road. No, we're talking next year already. We're talking that, by 2017, pension spending will have increased substantially in Brazil in view of what's happening to underlying demographics. So I fully agree, and I share, and this is why I share that sense of pessimism and am much less optimistic when I think about what's Brazil's growth potential going forward. Because it really, as we know, growth potential has to do with a combination of population growth, productivity. It boils down to those two things, actually, population growth and productivity. And productivity, on the other hand, boils down to whether or not you have investment. So if you don't have investment, or if you have very little of it, you don't get a lot of productivity growth. If you don't have a lot of population growth, well, there you go, your potential GDP is really not that great to start with. So these are serious issues. These are issues that I think have clearly not sunk in the way that they should have so far. And it's what leads me to kind of have a bleak view of what Brazil is going to look like even 5 years down the road. I mean, I don't think we are at a stage where we can look outwards and think, well, okay, we're going to recover that 4% rate of growth that we had, you know, just some 5-6 years ago. It's not going to happen. You know, it's not going to happen for these two reasons. So how do we get out of this? Honestly, I do not have the answer to that. I don't know. I think it's a very, very difficult process. We certainly don't get out of it by promoting more credit enhancing and consumerist policies, which is actually what is being discussed in Brazil at this very moment. You open the papers in Brazil today and you see that, you know, the government is actually speaking of, well, that's it, you know, the adjustment measures haven't worked. They haven't even been put in place. But you see this, you read this in the paper. The adjustment measures haven't worked, so let's try boosting credit again. Let's try, you know, increasing consumption and see if that works. You know, it won't work. We already know that. So it is very worrying and concerning to me when faced with these kinds of structural issues. The debate is still a debate that we had, you know, 8 years ago, and it's no longer valid. So thank you very much.
Professor Cesar also mentioned it at the beginning, right? The pensions.
Yeah. As I said before, we spend $400 billion, 40% reais in pension, 70 in investment. But to know the problem is quite easy if you see the budgetary problem. But to solve the problem is different. So let's talk about gender, the women and men. So the women in Brazil, they retire at 60 years old, and the men 65. But the ladies live 10 years more than the men. So why is different? But this kind of problem is not easy to solve. Yeah, you are machista or you are, you know. And I think Brazil has to face the real problem. It's easy to say this is a big problem, it's not, but how to solve the problem is difficult. But people are thinking about, and I disagree that the government is talking about space to increase credit. I think Mr. Levy is saying the opposite.
Lula is talking about.
But he is the government. But he is the government. Not Lula.
Well, that's something to
so, formal. And I think the discussion is not like that. I think the discussion is more deep than we are talking.
Michael, do you want to chime in?
A very quick thought, and I'm learning things about Brazilian politics as I'm sitting here, so thank you. One thing is, again, this pension crisis is not something that's unique to Brazil, although it might be particularly pertinent. And you can either solve it through immigration, which clearly doesn't seem to be on the cards, or you solve it through austerity, which will also be very difficult in a country where you already have large degrees of poverty, or you have to solve it through redefining what it means to work and what it means to have an entitlement. And so there is some hope in the sense that, again, new models of work and new models of technology can make it a lot easier to work through old age and into old age. But for that you need education, and for that you need, again, the good stories. And so indeed it's not easy, there are solutions there. I have to say I don't really see them constructively being thought about, again, to not blame Brazil too much. In almost any country of the world, the Germans have, in a sense, a much bigger demographic problem, not economic problem, but demographic problem. And even they're not thinking about it. They're kicking the can down the road because pensioners vote, and there's a lot of them. So you're not alone, I would say, but indeed, thanks for raising the point, because it's super important.
Monica, do you want to complement your answer?
Yeah, I just wanted to, no. I have to look at you though, but because it has to do with you. But if Minister Levy were the government, I think all things would have been resolved by now. So it's a bit more complicated than that, unfortunately. And as we know, many of the measures that Minister Levy put forward when he was announced as minister, and they were all going in the right direction, it should be said. He was the one who was out there back in January saying, here are the structural reforms that we need to do. We're going to have a short-term fiscal adjustment program that is going to lead us into a medium-term fiscal adjustment program, because there are a number of structural issues in Brazil that we need to resolve. And this is how he was thinking. He was putting the BNDES and the Brazil's National Development Bank within that same framework, of things that needed to be resolved. Unfortunately, Minister Levy is only Minister Levy. He has some very, very good and competent and extremely, good people working with him, but that's it. Apart from that, you've had the other minister, the planning minister, while Minister Levy was away, by the way, putting out this deficit, plan in 2016 for, so no fiscal adjustment. Basically, in 2016, we have a deficit, and it led to what it led, as Lisa knows. So, the situation is really not simple when you look at a government that hasn't really, the government as a whole, hasn't really come together and figured, has a consensus on what is actually needed. This is where some of my pessimism lies, unfortunately.
It's just so hard to do an event on just competitiveness and entrepreneurship and not talk about what's going on in the country. Right? It's impossible. We cannot detach one from the other. We have a question, I think. Do we have any more questions? Because we have more. Maybe we should just go through around the room and have all the questions, and they could answer them all, because we need to wrap it up in 3 minutes. So let's do that.
Good morning. I'd like to congratulate the speakers, especially Monica. I've heard it's been a while since I've heard such a lucid opinion on our economy. I'm not an economist. I'm a law professor, but I have the same opinion. I've been saying that it's not registered like yours. The reform we are trying to pass is very limited. We're only working commercial law. Unfortunately, we cannot change anything in the fiscal politics or pension funds. But I'd like to hear from if any of you have any ideas on this matter: corporate law, contracts, bankruptcy, commercial law, that we could do anything we can, because it's discussed by now, and we have 2 congressmen that are eager to hear. Yeah, I'm helping with the drafting of the code, so I'd love to hear any opinion of anything that could change to help us to be more competitive. That's it.
Thank you. So, thanks to the next one.
Yes, I have a simple question. Imagine that Brazil is an enterprise that has to go through a turnaround process. For a turnaround process, you need someone to lead the turnaround process. How can you do this if our leader has less than 10% approval?
Good one.
Good morning. My name is Julio from the Brazilian Consulate. Just a quick question, more specifically to Monica, regarding the inflation. What is the rationale of using interest rates in a context where demand is already really depressed, which is showed by the recession? And if the diagnosis of the inflation is indexation of the economy and the administered prices, I'd like you to comment on that. Thank you.
So, do you want to start by his, or?
I don't think I said at any point that the central bank should actually be raising interest rates. I believe I said the opposite. that the central bank should really be doing what it's doing, which is keeping interest rates on hold. For many reasons, including because I believe that I personally believe, and I'm writing a paper about this, that the current situation Brazil finds itself in is a situation that economists have known for a long time as fiscal dominance. That's a situation where the fiscal policy has kind of overridden the capacity of monetary policy to respond. And I think that's pretty much where we are at this stage. So, you know, I don't think it is viable for the central bank to raise interest rates in this scenario. I also think that the central bank is rightly concerned about the recession and about the depths of, you know, what's happening in the country more generally. So, you know, there's, to me, I've heard people in Brazil saying that the central bank should at this point be raising interest rates because of what's happening to inflation expectations and so on. I think, unfortunately, we're in a trap where we cannot do that, even if it would have been the recommended policy. So let me just clarify that so that point is not.
It is an opinion of one of the directors of the central bank. He said that publicly last week that they are not, they are willing to rise interest rates, even though the current situation. So
well, we will have to see, won't we? So far, what they've done is the opposite of what they said. Yes, I saw that that comment being made, and I read about it in the press. But so far, what the central bank has signaled in all its documents, and just to highlight that in Brazil, what matters is what the central bank says as a collegiate. So not as much as what one particular director says, but what the collegiate says, and what the collegiate has been saying in its reports and in its monetary policy minutes and so on, is that for now, interest rates are on hold. On the inflation question itself, Brazil is indexed, period. That's just the way it is. The economy is like that. And if we look at the latest inflation numbers, those for September and those for October, they don't have any administered price increases in them because that all took place earlier in the year, and yet inflation is accelerating. So there is an issue here of, you know, indexation taking over and the process becoming much like what we have seen in the past, though coming from a very different base. There is a generation in Brazil that hasn't really seen this kind of process. I may look young, but I'm not. I've seen that process in Brazil. I've lived through it. I know what it's like. You can have a recession and you can have an inflationary problem simultaneously. And it's what we have at the moment. So my cautionary note here is, don't expect that just because we have a recession, inflation's going to drop from 10 to 6 next year. Because there are other things going on in the economy right now. As I was saying before, what's happening is that people are setting wages and prices, and you talk to companies and you talk to, you know, people who are actual price setters in the economy, and their benchmark has become 10%. You know, everyone is setting prices based on 10% inflation. You get enough of the economy doing that, and your inflation is entrenched at 10%. It's how it works. So that is what scares me, and that has to do with the fact that we have that kind of dysfunction in the country at the moment has to do with the fact that there is no fiscal anchor and there is no monetary anchor. If you have neither, you get inflation. That's just how it is.
So on to the leadership question. How do you turn things around if you have no leaders? Cesar, do you want to? I don't want to put you in the hot seat, but I just...
It's difficult to answer that question. But he's right. So our difficulties is that because Lady President got only 10% approval, and the Congress against her. So it's very, very hard. But you know, now our political situation is a little bit calm, and I hope that we can sit together and discuss what is necessary to do for the country. So it's my wishful thinking.
From the outside in, and I think you have an even worse scenario, which is if your current leader doesn't have high approval, you might get a self-appointed leader that says, I can fix this, and that self-appointed leader might come from a part of the political spectrum that seems to have very simple answers, but is actually very dangerous. And again, in Europe, we're seeing some of this, the rise of populism, and there is no easy answer for sure, but everyone in this room who is connected in Brazil should work against that outcome, because that, to me, is far worse outcome.
That's a good point. So to her point about the contracts, and
I can quickly say, indeed, bankruptcy law in particular is one of the biggest inhibitors for entrepreneurship. So if you have rules where if you go bankrupt, you can't start a new company for another 10 years, obviously that puts most serial entrepreneurs out of business, and serial entrepreneurs are the lifeblood of entrepreneurship. On the flip side, you don't want serial bankrupters, so there is a bit of a balance to be done. But for that, I would actually look to countries like the US who have that equation sorted out quite well, and indeed it's very important from an entrepreneurship perspective.
Echo those points and say that I highly commend your efforts in doing this, because it's crucial for the country, and it's very good to see that at least these kinds of initiatives that do make a difference, even if they don't show as much in the current very messy scenario that we have, at one point they will bear fruit. And I think so. I just wanted to commend you for proceeding with this work, which I think is highly important for the country.
Apparently, we have 2 more questions from the table.
Good morning. My name is John Marcunas. I'm a business development consultant with a focus on the real estate industry in Brazil. I just got back from Brazil, spent 3 years in the Northeast, 2012 to 2015. First of all, thank you, Monica. I'm leaving here with a much clearer, I think, and realistic thought stream on Brazil, thanks to you. I think I've been reading too much in Brazilian Portuguese and the Folha de Sao Paulo and the Economy to really get a clear picture. My question is on infrastructure. I'm following up on the professor's comment on it. And as you can imagine, it might relate to me working and living in the Northeast. If it does, and how does entrepreneurship and competitiveness relate to the lack of work, the lack of infrastructure? And I was a little curious about that big blue dot in the Amazon on your slide. I wasn't quite sure if that related to anything related to the infrastructure up in Amazon. So this is an open question to everyone.
Yeah, Michael?
I'll have a first go. So firstly, infrastructure is clearly an enabler for entrepreneurship. So where you don't have the physical infrastructure in place to support the company that you're starting, you're already doomed to fail from the beginning. So indeed it's very important. The flip side is infrastructure in most countries, including this one, comes from the state. And so that's where the corruption, where the intransparency comes in. And it's very hard to do this, to Monica's point, in a fiscally constrained environment as well. So you have a real chicken and egg there. It's not going to be solved by roadshows, which is something that many countries try to do. Roadshows normally put investors off even more than anything else. So this is a very difficult process, and more transparency is part of the answer. More international openness is part of the answer, to have foreign investors come in or have foreign companies come in to help build the infrastructure. But this, by the very nature of the beast, takes time. So I don't have a very positive answer there.
Thank you very much for that question. And echoing Michael, fiscal constraints do bite here quite a bit. This said, I think Brazil again is at this turning point where a lot of things need to be rethought. And there's been a lot of thinking around the world about development banks and what their role should be. We have the AIIB initiative just being launched in Asia. A number of other development banks being launched around the world. Colombia has had a very good experience with its Financiera Nacional de Desarrollo, which is a development bank that basically does infrastructure only, and with a lot of it based on PPPs and things of that sort, and it's doing exceedingly well. And I think this is a moment for reflection on the part of Brazil with respect to its own national development bank. The BNDES has come under great scrutiny, as you all know, for a number of reasons. I think some of them the wrong reasons. I have a very particular opinion as to whether or not there should be any commissions of inquiry into BNDES. I don't think it helps the country any at this point in time. And the BNDES has been very important in Brazil's development over the years, and it has done, it has had a different role in the last few years that have actually complicated policy making in Brazil. But this is the exact right moment to rethink the role of BNDES and put BNDES on an infrastructure track more stringently. It's been on an infrastructure track, of course. It's been involved in a number of infrastructure projects throughout the decades in Brazil. But perhaps its focus really should be almost infrastructure only, I would argue. And with that comes, the other very difficult issue of resolving in Brazil, which is infrastructure projects or long-term projects. Long-term projects need long-term capital markets. We don't have long-term capital markets in Brazil. Part of the reason why we don't have long-term capital markets in Brazil has to do with the way that capital markets are set up. So we have this, strange creature called the TJLP, which is the long-term interest rate, which is set by the National Monetary Council. It's not a market-determined rate. And the fact that it's not a market-determined rate and it's actually, lower than what a market-determined rate would likely be, prevents capital markets from developing. So we have one, and this issue is very much linked to BNDES because all of BNDES's lending takes place through using TJLP, the long-term interest rate, as its reference rate. So we have an issue to resolve there, which is refocusing the BNDES on the one hand and rethinking this long-term interest rate and to what extent it should be better linked to the reference rate of the economy plus a risk premium to properly reflect what a term structure for the economy would be had we proper long-term credit markets functioning. So this is another structural issue in the agenda that we need to be thinking about. And I fear that before these things are actually thought through and done, and Levy and his people were thinking along these lines, but obviously the political environment doesn't let these things go very far. But until we have that, I also fear that we won't get much in terms of infrastructure. So I'm with Michael on that one.
For you is the blue dot on the map.
Yes,
You know about
Yes.
We have more questions.
Can I just say something? I would like just to thank you all for your comments, because the main reason we are here is for the first time in our history we are making a serious effort to learn with the international good experiences and examples. And we have a report here which we were doing, like we finished yesterday. It's like all the problems that we are trying to solve with this new code. And this is based on the doing business studies that the World Bank, everything that they said to us about how to fix problems economically and everything. Of course, we cannot change everything, but we are taking serious steps in this matter. And so I would like to thank you all for your comments, and be sure we will consider it a lot and do whatever we can to put this in practice.
Thank you. So I think we need to wrap up. Just to summarize a little bit of the discussions, I think number one, there is a sense of urgency, and we have to do our homework, and we need to do the reforms that we need to do it. There's no time anymore to just stall and delay. Number two, there are very different kinds of entrepreneurship and innovation, and I think it's important to socially and culturally also to dream big and to be entrepreneurial. And number 3 is very hard to talk about, again, competitiveness and entrepreneurship in the current context. I think it would be great for us to redo this at one point and have better news and have a better perspective on where to go. But thank you. Please join me on thanking the panelists